Are you familiar with an Israeli study that had 2.5 million patients and found that the vaccinated group was actually 7 times more likely to get infected with COVID than the people who had gotten COVID naturally?
Senator, I'd have to get back to you on that one. I'm not familiar with that study.
Well, you think you might want to be if you're going to travel the country insulting the millions of Americans, including NBA star Jonathan Isaac, who have had COVID, recovered, look at a study with 2.5 million people and say, well, you know what? It looks like my immunity is as good as a vaccine or not. And in a free country, maybe I ought to be able to make that decision. Instead, you've chosen to travel the country calling people like Jonathan Isaac and others, myself included, flat earthers. We find that very insulting, goes against the science. Are you a doctor or a medical doctor?
I've worked over 30 years on health policy.
You're not a medical doctor. Do you have a science degree? And yet you travel the country calling people flat earthers who have had COVID, looked at studies of millions of people, and made their own personal decision that their immunity they naturally acquired is sufficient. But you presume somehow to tell over 100 million Americans who have survived COVID that we have no right to determine our own medical care. You alone are on high, and you've made these decisions, a lawyer with no scientific background, no medical degree. This is an arrogance coupled with an authoritarianism that is unseemly and un-American. You, sir, are the one ignoring the science. The vast preponderance of scientific studies, dozens and dozens, show robust, long-lasting immunity after COVID infection. Even the CDC does not recommend measles vaccine if you have measles immunity. The same was true for smallpox. But you ignore history and science to shame the flat earthers, as you call them. You should be ashamed of yourself and apologize to the American people for being dishonest about naturally acquired immunity. You want more people to choose vaccination? So do I. You want to lessen vaccine hesitancy? So do I. You want to have that happen? Quit lying to people about naturally acquired immunity. Quit lording it over people, acting as if these people are deplorable and unwashed. Try persuasion instead of government cudgels. Try humility instead of arrogance. Try freedom instead of coercion. But most of all, try understanding that there's no more basic medical right than deciding what we inject into our bodies. Today, after hearing that millions of people in a study show without a doubt that there's a great deal of immunity from getting it naturally, do you want to apologize to the 100 million Americans who suffered through COVID, survived, have immunity, and yet you want to hold them down and vaccinate them? Do you want to apologize for calling those people flat earthers?
Senator, I appreciate your question and appreciate that everyone has their opinion. We follow the facts and the science at HHS. We use the expertise of the medical professionals, the scientists at HHS to make decisions. It's a team effort, and we rely on what is on the ground showing us results.
Except for the dozens and dozens of studies. In fact, most, if not all of the studies show robust immunity from getting the disease naturally. The CDC says if you've had measles and have immunity, you don't have to be vaccinated. The same was true of smallpox. You're selectively doing this because you want us to submit to your will. You have no scientific background, no scientific degrees, and yet you aren't really concerned about 100 million Americans who had the disease. You just want to tell us, do as you're told. That's what you're telling us. You want to mandate this on all of us. You're going to tell us if I have 100 employees, you're going to put me out of business with a $700,000 fine if I don't obey what you think is a science. Don't you understand that it's presumptuous for you to be in charge of all the science? Have you ever heard of a second opinion? I can't go to my doctor and ask my doctor's opinion. I mean, this is incredibly arrogant, combined with this authoritarian nature that you think, well, we'll just tell all of America to do what I say, and they better, or we'll fine them, or put them in jail, or not let them go to school, or not let them travel. The science is against you on this. The science is clear. Naturally acquired immunity is as good as a vaccine. The Israel study actually showing it better. This isn't an argument against the vaccine, but it's an argument for letting people make a decision who already have immunity. You're not willing to consider natural immunity?
Senator, our team has reviewed every study that's out there on COVID, whether it's from Israel, from the U.S., or wherever else. They have used the facts that have been provided through the rigorous research that's been done to reach a conclusion. 660,000 Americans and more have died because of COVID. We're trying to do everything we can to save as many as possible. We're using the facts, we're following the science, and following the law.
Nobody's arguing the severity of this, but you are completely ignoring the science on natural immunity. So's Fauci, so's the whole group. You're just ignoring it because you want submission. You want everybody just to submit to your will, do as you're told, despite the evidence, the large body of scientific evidence that says naturally acquired immunity does work, is an important part of how we're all going to recover from this. So's the vaccine. But when you add them together, we're at a much different place than if you ignore them. 100 million Americans, by conservative CDC estimates, have had the disease. 200 million or more now have been vaccinated. It's a good thing. Combined together, it's how the disease is. Nobody wants to get the disease. We're not advising anybody to get the disease. But if you're unlucky enough to get it, think of the nurses and doctors and orderlies who all bravely took care of COVID patients. There was no vaccine for a year and a half. They took care of people, risked their lives. They got it, survived, and now people like you are arrogant enough to say you can no longer work in the hospital because you've already had the disease. We're going to force you to take a vaccine that the science does not prove is better than naturally acquired. That's an arrogance that should be chastened.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Cruz.
We talked just a minute ago about the difference between law and politics. We heard some impassioned political speeches, but also a question that just was asked by my friend from New Jersey. Is there anything in this memo to tell a parent that they're being targeted for harassment and intimidation? I would note that the letter from the school boards cited 20 instances, 15 of which were nonviolent. The letter from the school board described them as domestic terrorism. Within days, the Department of Justice snapped to the commands of the special interest and issued a memo, a directive to the Department of Justice and a directive to the FBI. This is, again, where law matters. The opening sentence describes a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence. Now, you spent a long time as a judge when you have three things listed. Am I correct that anyone interpreting that, reading it, would conclude that harassment and intimidation are something different than threats of violence, given that you listed each of the three out separately? Is that consistent with the canons of construction?
The memorandum is addressed to professional prosecutors.
I asked you a question, not who it was addressed to.
Senator, at least let him respond.
No, not when he answers a non sequitur. If
He
wants
may
to
respond
answer okay,
any
you're
way
taking my time now. This is not coming out of my time.
Listen,
when I ask a question,
we've given
he
you
can
more
answer
time than any other senator.
Mr. Chairman,
Now listen,
when I ask
all I'm
the
asking
question,
is allow him to respond.
Mr. Chairman, when I ask a question, he can answer the question, but he's proceeding to ask a total non sequitur. I asked about the canons of construction on the board.
Please let him respond.
I'll ask the question again. The opening line of the memo specifies harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence. Is it correct under the ordinary canons of construction that a legal reader would understand that harassment and intimidation means something different from threats of violence? Is that correct?
A legal reader would know Virginia versus Black, the Supreme Court definition of intimidation, and a legal reader would know 18 U.S.C. 2261A, the definition of harassment.
And would a parent?
This was not addressed to parents.
But you know, parents read it. You're the Attorney General of the United States. You said you can't think of anything harassing. You directed the G-men, the FBI, to go after parents. All right, let's move on to a different topic. We've sadly seen that you are willing to use the enforcement power of the Department of Justice to target those who have political views different than you, even if it's a mom at a PTA meeting. Let's try the other side. Are you willing to enforce the law fairly against people who are political allies of the president? At a Senate hearing in May, Dr. Fauci said, quote, "The NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research in the Wuhan Institute of Virology." That was under oath, under testimony. On October 20th, the NIH principal deputy director, in writing, directly contradicted it. Those two statements cannot be true. As you know, Section 1001 of Title 18 makes it a federal crime to knowingly make false statements to Congress. As the Department of Justice investigating Dr. Fauci for lying to Congress, and will you appoint a special prosecutor to do so?
I'm going to say again, the memorandum that I issued is not partisan in any way. It has nothing to do with what I agree with or I don't agree with. I don't care whether the threats of violence come from the left or the right.
Could you answer
Now,
the
with
question I
respect to
asked?
The second question, we don't comment on criminal investigations or other investigations.
Well, amazingly, when it's the political enemies of the administration, you comment loudly in a memo. Let me ask one other question.
You're not asking- you weren't-
President Biden recently said in a national town hall that police officers who decline to get vaccinated should be fired. Do you agree with President Biden on that?
I think all police officers, look, I stood on the stage at the mall where the 700 and some police officers who died this year were commemorated.
Let me try again. Do
Huge
you agree with the
percentage
president? It's a yes or no. You've asked questions as a judge. You know how to get a yes or no. Do you agree with the president? Yes or no?
A large percentage of the law officers who died this year died from COVID-19.
Do you agree with President Biden that police officers who decline to get vaccinated should be fired? Yes or no?
And if they had been vaccinated, they wouldn't have died.
So is that a yes? You do agree with the
Not
president?
one police officer.
In Chicago, a third of the police officers did not file their vaccination status. Do you think Chicago should fire a third of its police officers when murder rates and crime rates are skyrocketing?
This is a determination that the city of Chicago will have to make.
So do you agree with the president? The president said yes. Do you agree with him? You are the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. Do you agree with Joe Biden saying fire police officers despite skyrocketing crime rates?
That is a question that is a one of state law there and will have to be decided by the state.
You have no view on whether we should fire
Senator,
cops?
your time has expired.
Well, you used 2 minutes.
No, I certainly did not. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr.